Thanks everybody for joining us for today's webinar on organic site preparation for pocket meadows. I am Kelsey Mummer and I'm the Lawn to Habitat Program Coordinator at the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. We're really excited to have you with us as we explore approaches to preparing your pocket meadows using organic methods. Effective site preparation is one of the most important factors in creating a successful meadow, and today's presentation will provide that practical guidance and lessons learned from an expert who's done a lot of this. I just want to note that our participant cameras and microphones are turned off. We are going to answer as many questions as possible at the end of Kelly's presentation. So please use that Q&A feature at the top of your screen to ask your questions. And I think there is a feature within that to allow you to upvote. So if you also have a similar question or that same question, go ahead and upvote it. And that'll make those more popular questions rise to the top. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Kelly Gill. Kelly is a senior pollinator conservation specialist with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation and a partner biologist with the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service East National Technology Support Center. Kelly provides technical assistance to NRCS staff, partners, producers, land managers, and communities for implementing conservation practices for pollinators, beneficial insects, and other wildlife. This technical support includes planning, designing, and installing habitat plantings, such as wildflower meadows, flowering hedgerows, riparian buffers, and native plant gardens. Kelly also works with agency staff and research partners on the development of technical guidelines, outreach materials, and training programs to guide pollinator conservation efforts. Kelly earned a master's degree in entomology from Iowa State University. And if you received one of our Pocket Meadow kits, you'll notice that she was one of the authors on that organic site preparation guide. If we have any questions about organic site preparation or just meadow establishment period, Kelly is always my go-to. So I'm very excited to have her presenting today to you all. So thank you again for being here. And I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic over to Kelly.
Thank you for that nice introduction. And hello, everybody. I'm happy you're here. If you don't know about the Xerces Society, just for a little introduction, you can check us out and our work at xerces.org. We are an international nonprofit organization working to protect insects and at a larger scale, biodiversity. So all of the things that insects do for us at the bottom of the food chain, like feed other animals, and those ecosystem services like pollination and ecological pest control and so on and so forth. We have a lot of different programs in the organization. I work on the pollinator and agricultural biodiversity team, but we also have programs looking at aquatic invertebrates, endangered species, pesticide protection. We have community engagement and community science programs. So please do check us out. We also have a YouTube channel chock full of tons of different webinars that you might be interested in. Too much to talk about today because I want to get right into the topic of organic site preparation so we could use this time resourcefully. I'll start off by saying there are a lot of decisions that go into meadow establishment or wildflower habitat establishment. We do have regional guides. Here are a couple featuring states or areas in the East region where I am working. And they are available online, free to download. So if you're wanting to see the full process from decision making and planning all the way through long-term management, plant lists, seed samples, seed mixes, things like that, they are included in these guides. They are just guides, so I really do want to emphasize at the top of this presentation is that there is no one-size-fits-all recipe. If there was, I'd probably be sitting on a beach somewhere, relaxing. But that's not the case. We really do site-specific planning, and that is one of the biggest paths to success. So we want to meet people where they are, understand the site conditions, understand what we're working with, what's the starting point, what's the end goal, what kind of resources are available. And so when we say, this meadow is a success, That's on a sliding scale. What was there before? What does that improvement look like? And does it meet the goals that were established in the beginning of the process? Yep. So these will give you an idea of the different methods from site prep to seeding to management, but really it depends on the site, the person that's doing the work, or if they're contracting out the work. And that's really important to understand at the beginning. I wish I could just give you a cookie cutter recipe, but that is not the case. So I'm showing here some of those installation guides. We'll send out links specifically to the organic site preparation guide. That is a larger manual. I think it's about 80 pages. So there's a lot of information. This guide is also set up into different regions. So it covers the Midwest and the East and the West. We're focusing on the East clearly, but if you have friends, out West in California or in the Midwest, there are sections here too that would apply to them. We also have this smaller guide, this comparative overview. It's kind of your quick pick chart of the different methods that will give you a brief overview of what's in the guide in case you want to just get a summary at the top. So this is useful for making, some of those initial decisions, maybe eliminating methods that don't apply to you. And that is online as well. We'll also send out a link. And so here are some of the overarching kind of big picture phases of meadow establishment, right? First, we all get excited when we want to do something. I know I do. And so I want to jump right in, right? Get started because we want to get to that result and we want to show that we were successful. But really what we should be doing is taking some time to sit down and make a really meaningful, well thought out plan. That will help you in the long run, right? So some of the phases are site selection and evaluation. We're not going to get into that too much today. I have 1 or 2 slides on that. But what we do is go out to a site, do site visits, 1 or multiple, depending on the complexity of the site, and do an inventory. So what's there? What's the existing vegetation? Where are we going to put this habitat? What kind of weed control do we need? Is there existing habitat already on the site that we could connect to or even manage better for pollinators? So we do that and we have a whole checklist that we fill out and do this assessment and we get kind of a benchmark score for that site. And what we want to see, obviously, when we do the plan score is that our plan is going to get a higher score. So it signifies an improvement. And then we can go back again and assess the actual, what actually happened and see how that aligns with our plan and how that score improved. So those evaluation guides are also on our webpage. Planning and design. So what's the configuration of this habitat? How big is it? Are you going to do it all at once? Are you going to kind of do it in stages? If you have a small area, that could be manageable to do all at once. If you have a large acreage, sometimes we split it up into chunks. Designing things like selecting plants and seed mixes. There are a lot of off-the-shelf seed mixes that may work really well for your site, but some of them will not. Sometimes you need a customized mix to match those conditions. We want those plants to grow and establish and persist. So picking the right plants for the right place is very important as well. And that's something we can help people with. Site preparation, which we're going to talk about today, so I won't go into detail here. Plant establishment, how are you going to seed? That will help make some decisions as well on site prep, the seed mix. You don't want to get all the way through those like the first 3 or 4 steps and make a mistake, with seeding. So that's an important consideration as well. And then this should really be 6 phases. Short-term management while that meadow is establishing, so the first 2 years, and then long-term management after you see that full seed mix hopefully established on your site. So here I have a picture of a meadow that's in a residential housing complex, development. And this is a meadow that is actually around their detention pond. So not only is it helping with pollinators, biodiversity, wildlife, it's also helping to filter water, to slow water with water drainage. So it's adding other benefits. And we try to consider those as well when we're planning. Um, Not a lot of people have a lot of land to give up, so we want to make the best of what we can do with what we have. So when you're out on a site selecting where you're going to put your meadow, sometimes this is obvious because there's only one place it could go. This is all I have space for, and that's what we have to work with. Um, and sometimes that's good, and sometimes that's bad. It just depends on the site, how much time and effort that will take. But here's some questions we ask ourselves. Is this a location where plants will establish well and persist? Sometimes people aren't giving up, prime real estate for their meadow. It might be in the backyard or the back of a property or part of a farm that's not very productive. Maybe a weedy area that you want to fix and make better. And so we really want to be able to work with that. But sometimes we do run into areas where it's either going to be very, very difficult and you'll need, a lot of time, effort, and resources to establish a meadow there. And sometimes it's a really prime location. And we'll talk about what those might look like. We do want to make sure that where we're planting is not an area that is subject to pesticide risk or direct spray or overspray or drift from coming from other parts of the property or neighboring properties. We don't want to build habitat and attract a lot of pollinators and have it exposed to insecticide that will harm them, and also herbicide drift that can harm the plants. So thinking about that's important when you're doing your site assessment. We also think about the conditions, pretty obvious, the soils, the slope, the drainage, the moisture, light, are we partially shaded? Are we in full sun? A lot of these meadow plants will not grow well in heavy shade, in dense shade. So we want to make sure that we are planting them in an area that does get sunlight. And if we do have some shade, we want to tailor that mix to species that will tolerate part shade. Seasonal conditions, I've been out to several sites, maybe in the fall, and it looks great. And then I find out every spring that area is totally flooded. I wasn't there in the spring, so I didn't know. So thinking about that and communicating that to people that you might be working with on your plan is important. Accessibility. Can you get to the site easily? Can you get equipment in there all year round, or especially those very targeted times when you need to do management? The timelines are important. If you let things get away from you, you could have a problem in the end. So, having that be accessible, monitoring the meadow over time is really important. So making sure you could get boots on the ground out there to take a look at what's going on. Identify issues that you may have. What equipment do you have available? It doesn't do anybody a good service to recommend seeding or site prep methods that they can't do because they don't have that particular piece of equipment or can't get access to it. Connectivity I talked about as well. We are living in a landscape where we're losing thousands of acres of open space in daily, weekly, in some cases. And so we want to make sure that if we do have existing habitat, that we can connect those, right? That's not just good for pollinators, that's good for other wildlife as they move through our landscape to get resources they need to, complete their life cycle. Other resource concerns I mentioned earlier, is there erosion issues? Can this also be a buffer for a stream or waterway? And then other unique conditions or features, are there rare animals or plants on site? Is it, a sensitive habitat that we have to be aware of? One of the big things I jump up and down and cause a big scene about because I want people to remember is weed pressure. What you're starting with is going to matter. And so we like to prioritize areas of a site that have low or maybe even moderate weed pressure. If we get into sites where there is really heavy infestations of pervasive or invasive species that are hard to control and eliminate, you're going to have your work cut out for you. Sometimes we might even recommend not doing it if you can't follow, a longer timeline, or if you don't have those resources. Or we might suggest another area of the farm where it will be a little easier. It's already a complicated process. We don't want to overcomplicate anymore. Understanding the expectations and creating a realistic timeline. We all want to get to the finish line. We all want to show off what we've done and the good things that are happening, but that takes time. So patience, pack your patience. That's the biggest tool here. Um, Using methods and timing that are most effective against that target weed species. Again, proper equipment. Weeds that are surrounding the area that you might be planting. So if you have forest edges or weedy field margins, you want to be aware of that. We know how weeds can quickly move into other areas of our landscape and create, larger problems. So those will need to be attended to as well. Woody encroachment, that is, if you want to keep it as early successional open habitat, you're going to have to control for woody encroachment here in the Northeast. That is something that is different than in the Midwest in a lot of cases where, they have that open prairie as one of their large ecosystems. Here in the East, a lot of times we're forcing prairie or meadows into an area that wants to be forest. And there are other differences as well. So if you're looking at, guidance coming out of the Midwest, it will be different than guidance that we give in the East. The plants grow differently here. We have, just different issues than they do there. So that is a consideration as well. And it's also been a learning process. Weed seed is going to be that weed seed bank in the soil. We want to consider that and exhaust that before we plant our desirable seed mix. And then what was the land use before? In particular, has herbicide been used? And is there any residual activity? I realize that we are talking about organic methods here, but it might be a site that had herbicide use in the past that's transitioning. So you want to be aware of that as well, because that could impede some of the germination and growth of seeds, of wildflower seeds. So, areas like this with reed canary grass, or all the way to the right here, this farm that I was working with, I mean, this is just wall to wall to wall mugwort. To establish a meadow on that site would take several years of site prep. And so, I don't want to lie to people and say like, well, you could probably do it in 20 years or 10 years. Sometimes I want to set people up for success, not failure. The site in the middle, lawn areas that have had weed control for multiple years, crop fields coming out of production tend to be an easier way to get these established, an easier starting point. And so I believe a lot of you here are starting with lawn. You might have some weeds intermixed in there or on the margins to be aware of. But just know, low weed pressure is where we want to start if at all possible. So why is site prep so important? I think that picking the seed mix, thinking about plants, going towards that goal, seeing the plants bloom and having flower visitors come in is more exciting, right? Site prep is not that exciting. In fact, it's work. It's a little boring, but it is one of the most important components of project success. And unfortunately, it's often inadequately addressed. So people think they could get away with taking shortcuts. We all wish we had shortcuts, but please know that put your time and effort into this part of the process. It will pay off in the long run. So I talked about some of this already: assess current conditions, a realistic site prep plan, and a timeline. Managing landowner expectations is something that I am very aware of and do all the time. That will set the stage for what they can expect as the meadow establishes, what may be good, what might look like an issue that they might want to reach out and discuss or address. This will take at least a full season of repeated treatments, whether it's chemical or organic, the ones we'll talk about today. So, don't start late in the summer and plant in the fall. That's not enough time. You want to really start in the spring, at least before a fall planting, or sooner, maybe the previous fall. Sites with high weed pressure will require more than 1 year of site prep. Monitoring and eliminating weed growth along the way is critical. We'll talk about that a lot. And using methods and timing that are appropriate for the type of vegetation and species. So here's some examples of us out in the field, talking to people, doing the inventory and site assessment, looking at what's around. Critical part of the process. So here are some examples of organic site prep methods. Repeated shallow cultivation. So I don't want to say tillage, even though it is a type of tillage. We don't typically, most of the time, want to recommend deep plowing or aggressive tillage. That can bring up dormant weed seeds that are deeper in the soil profile and exacerbate weed problems or cause new weed problems that you haven't seen. We want to keep those sleeping way under the soil. But we do need to exhaust the weed seeds that are in the top profile of the soil, because we're going to be disturbing that throughout this process. And we'll talk more about each of these as we go on. Smother cropping, so that is potentially doing, less tillage, maybe 1 or 2 rounds of shallow cultivation, and then planting something like you see in the bottom center here, a dense cover crop of buckwheat in the warm season, just to reduce the amount of times you're disturbing the soil. So I should mention, and I didn't at the top, that all of these methods come with pros and cons. So, with the tillage, we have soil disturbance. We want to stay away from doing that on highly erodible land. But in the end, we're planting permanent vegetation, and that soil is going to recover a lot faster than it would if it were an annually tilled system over years and years and years and years. Tarping and solarization. So solarization is using clear plastic on top of the soil to cook the weed seeds. Tarping or occultation is using dark plastic. So, that works well in some cases, depending on what vegetation is there. But it also comes with a lot of plastic waste. If people have this on hand, or if they can get it, used plastic from a local farmer that has high tunnels or hoop houses or a greenhouse, or even sometimes we have agricultural waste facilities that we can get used plastic from. But then you have a lot of plastic on the ground. Sheet mulching, which I don't have pictured here, we'll talk about briefly. That's good for smaller sites, mostly garden-sized sites. Sod cutting, which you see in the bottom left here, which is just removing, kind of scalping that top layer of sod until you get bare soil. Controlled burns or flame weeding. I'm not going to talk about that too much today, but that is an option, and in particular for larger sites. For smaller sites that I think most people here are dealing with, that would be a tough sell. And then taking an integrated approach, combining some of these methods can be the best way to go. So let's talk about repeated shallow cultivation. This is a a very common weed control method used on organic farms and gardens. The goal again is to, like I said, exhaust the weed seed bank. So what you would do in this situation is mow very low, and then start that shallow, only a couple inches, 2 or 3 inches, disturbing that top layer of soil. What you're doing is bringing those non-dormant weed seeds up and they see the light of day, and you want them to germinate. You want to encourage them to germinate, and then the repeated tillage part is continuously knocking them back. So I compare it to like a boxing match. You do one round, they come back up, you knock them back, pulling them up from the surface when they're seedlings or small plants, allowing them to desiccate on the soil surface. And doing that over and over again until you get the knockout and you don't have a lot of that regrowth, right? Because when weeds are if they regrow, if they resprout in your mix, they're a lot harder to control when they're mixed in with your desirable plants, right? Unless you want to be out there kind of hand weeding and really micromanaging. So with this, we need to consider implements or tools that can be set to a shallow depth. If you have a larger area, this may mean, kind of more farm style equipment, like these spades you see here. Or, walk behind rototillers. You could get mechanical ones. They have, non-powered ones as well. So making sure you're not going too deep is key. You also don't want to use this method if you have a site that's very wet, or when it is very wet. You'll just cause clumping and clods and ruts in your soil. That can be an issue in the future. Timing is critical. So you got to be monitoring. You got to be looking at those little weeds to sprout, for those little weeds to sprout back up so you can get on it right away. Use where erosion is not a concern, wet conditions, I talked. Avoiding deep tillage. There are very few situations where we do use soil inversion or deep tillage. That would be, a special situation. And then with this, you could combine, like I said earlier, with a smother crop or some kind of annual cover for a short period of time, choosing certain species, and these are mostly agricultural cover crops, that grow fast and densely, that will smother weeds, that will compete against them, causing shade and competition for resources. The key there is that, and we'll talk about that, is that you need that smother crop to grow well, right? And so if it grows in spotty and has open areas, those still are little gaps for weeds to come in. So oftentimes, and I'm working a lot in agricultural lands or working lands, both rural and urban, people are busy during the summer, and that goes for residential places and parks too, right? The summer's a busy season. And so planting a warm season cover crop will allow some time away from tillage and soil disturbance, right? So you could do this for one or more growing seasons, depending on what you're starting with and the weed pressure on site and your timeline. Again, timing is essential. It requires being attentive to management, species selection based on soils and the weeds that are there, and what termination methods are you going to use, right? So there are some really good smother crops out there, things like sunflower or sorghum Sudan grass. They do a great job, but they also have a lot of biomass to deal with when you terminate it. So if you're not into that, things like buckwheat, which you see here, this flowering plant, do really well. It grows to maturity in about 45 days, so you could actually double seed it in one summer here. It also provides some flowers in the meantime. It looks pretty. And so you're actually providing some intermediate resources for pollinators. Heft grass is another one you could see on the side here. That's a lower growing grass. That can be easily terminated as well. And so these are things that we would do in the warm season. Some people are preparing their sites the fall before and they want to do a winter cover. So that could be something like winter oats. Sometimes winter rye is recommended, but just know if that's what you're using and if you plant that to cover your field in the fall, or if you plant it as a nurse crop with a pollinator mix, that rye is going to resume growth pretty rapidly in the spring. And you need to be on top of high mowing it and knocking it back so it doesn't outcompete your wildflowers. So if I don't feel comfortable with that being a possibility, that kind of follow-up mowing, then that might not be the right cover or nurse crop for you to use, right? Also, these are very, they're not very thick stemmed plants. They terminate easily. So you have less biomass to deal with when you're trying to get them off the field. So here's kind of the timeline, a very basic timeline. Again, it would be site specific depending on where you are. But for the east, you want to get in there in the spring and till or do your shallow cultivation and prepare a nice seed bed before those winter and spring annual weeds pop up. 2 weeks later, repeat that again. And then repeat it again in late May, early June, and then by June the soil is warm enough for these winter warm season cover crop plants to grow and bloom. So you want to immediately seed that crop. Make sure, go out and check on it as it's coming up. Make sure that there are not gaps in the seeding. If there are, I always tell people to get a little extra seed and make sure you're going around filling in the gaps. We really want to choke those weeds out. About 45 days later, as these are starting to flower, when you see some start to flower, maybe about 40–50% flowering, you want to terminate that. And you could immediately seed a second buckwheat crop. And then same thing in the fall. Once you see those plants flowering, you want to terminate them before they go to seed. They will reseed. It's okay if, a few buckwheat plants pop up in your meadow, no big deal, but we don't want it to be, another dense, dense cover of buckwheat that would, require some more work. And then you want to mow or rake. You could do the termination by tillage, or mowing and then raking the residue off so you have a bare soil again. The reason we need bare soil for all of these processes for site preparation, that's what we're aiming for, is because the wildflower seed requires seed to soil contact to germinate. So if you throw it out on thatch or existing vegetation, it's not going to get down to the soil. And then they're slow growing plants. There are a few species we put in that pop up pretty quickly. Those tend to be biennials or annuals, and they'll peter out of the planting over time. But they do give us a little bit of hope and instant satisfaction that some things are coming up. But the majority of plants in a native pollinator mix, you won't see germinate and bloom until years 2, 3, 4, and sometimes beyond. So we really need that area free of competition so these plants can get a foothold, germinate, and once they germinate and grow, they become pretty competitive against weeds themselves. Solarization and tarping. So we've done trials here, and solarization works sometimes. It's effective when it's in full sun. So if you have a site that has full sun, direct sunlight, and it works with, the weather conditions. So it can be variable. What we do here is we lay that plastic down, tuck it in, weight it down somehow, and I have some slides on that I'll show, and really create a really tight seal, right? That will allow that temperature underneath the plastic to get to a point where you're cooking those non-dormant weed seeds and other vegetation that might be germinating with heat. It works great for my coworkers in California. I mean, they could cook something in a short period of time. In our region, it's a little more variable, but if you do use it, you want to use UV stable, anti-condensation clear plastic. You don't want it breaking down in the sun. Once it gets a hole or gap or rip or damage and lets air flow in, that will, break that seal and things will start germinating and surviving. Um, the soil must stay moist. So a lot of times we'll do, mow, maybe do a passive tillage to get excess vegetation off, break up those roots, and then we water it again to encourage those seeds to germinate and grow and cook off. Um, Here in the Northeast, we find that using black plastic or silage tarp um, is better. So this works by, depraving those seeds and plants of sunlight. Um, it works better in cooler climates. And oftentimes people have more access to these materials. And so here's kind of what that process might look like. This is obviously larger farm equipment. This could be a rototiller as well. You want this nice, clean, seed bed or soil surface. Either trenching the sides of the area and tucking that plastic in and burying it, or weighting it down with something like sandbags, rocks, tires, whatever you have around, making sure, again, you have that tight seal, regardless of if it's clear or black plastic. Leaving that on for a whole season, removing it in the fall. There's a caveat there I'll get to. And then here we see this is a broadcast planting, so broadcasting seed. And then yay, pollinator habitat. Here's another kind of just visual of trenching around the corners. You could do this with different types of material or different types of equipment. It might be a little hard to hand trench unless you have a big team, but that's a really effective way of getting that tight seal. And the plastic usually comes in these kind of long, narrow strips, about 6 foot wide. And so if you're doing a large area, you could put the plastic on this strip for the first year, keep that one end tucked in, the one end that's closer to the field, take the end near the tree line and just kind of move it over and kind of, keep hopping along the field and solarizing or tarping other parts. So, it's kind of leapfrogging the plastic if you want to do your site in chunks, in phases. If you do get multiple sheets of plastic for, kind of a larger block, you do want to kind of fold those edges together and, attach it somehow so that the seams where those two pieces of plastic meet are sealed. Here's kind of a smaller version of that. This is at a park. So you can see here all the sandbags. They could be a pain in the butt, but they're necessary. Any way you could weight that down along the edges, so it doesn't blow away. So you maintain that, kind of flat seal is the way to go. So if you're using the black plastic, there is one extra step, especially if you have, thick, cool season pasture grasses or persistent grasses or other persistent weeds. Mow, remove thatch, lay the tarp, with multiple pieces overlap, add the sandbags. You want to kind of peek at it throughout the season, especially in summer, late summer. Remove the tarp temporarily and rake off any residue that might be smothering anything else that can germinate. Lay the tarp back down for a couple months until you get to that fall dormant seeding, or keep it on through winter if you're seeding in the spring. So this is kind of what that can look like underneath. You see this matted, thick residue of sod. This doesn't work well if you have a field full of like rhizomatous perennial weeds, things like mugwort and thistle. They will send out shoots and just grow around the sides of the plastic. Here are some different materials. This is woven landscape fabric. This is kind of stapled down into these pieces of wood here along the edge. And this is kind of a silage tarp, thick black plastic. You want it to be very thick and durable. So this is tilled. This is just two examples of this is mowed and tilled prior to laying the tarp. You get a much cleaner result. This side here was only mowed. And then the vegetation removed, like I said, raking it off or removing it somehow mid-end summer and then putting it back on. So that round of tillage really does help, even though it's another step in the process. Sod cutting, you could rent a sod cutter from hardware stores. You can do this with a shovel if you're so inclined and want a good workout. You could do it with a skid steer or other, machinery. Again, you don't want to go too deep. You want to just get that first layer off. So cutting and removing the sod completely, great for smaller plantings. And I only say that because you end up with, if you can see in the corner of this top picture here, a lot of sod material to remove and take off site. There have been some instances where we were able to donate it for resodding somewhere else, but it's a lot of heavy material to deal with. So you could certainly do this on a larger scale if you have the means to, get rid of that stuff. It's great for turf sites that have been mowed for many years. Simple approach for lawn conversion, but there is lots of biomass. But you can see they got a nice result here. Here's the, site prep after they remove the sod. Continue to monitor that for weedy regrowth over the season before you seed and eliminate those weeds. And then this site was planted in the fall, so this is the following spring. Or taking an integrated approach, which is my favorite because it often it buys some time and often makes things easier. So I mentioned the shallow cultivation with a smother crop. So this would be similar to that. This is sod cutting, or you could use cultivation here plus tarping. So removing those strips of sod. This is a park where they're kind of making these little islands and borders of habitat. Removing that from those areas and then immediately tarping it. That will help, smother and eliminate that residual weed growth afterwards. And it's nice to have these pollinator habitat in progress signs. We have them available. I think that might be already available to you through Kelsey's program. But just to let people know what's going on and why there's a bunch of plastic on the ground and what's happening is really beneficial. It also kind of piques curiosity, so people might come back and look at it later and be like, oh, that's really cool. Another method of smothering is smothering with cardboard, or what we sometimes call sheet mulching. Again, great for same kind of concept as tarping, put the cardboard down. Oftentimes people might wet it or weight it down. So again, it's good for small areas if you're doing little bits at a time. Sometimes people will put the cardboard down and then layer on top of it other organic material, like compost and mulch, and let those layers, kind of help the soil. Mowing low beforehand is key. Again, not effective for rhizomatous or woody species if those are on your site. And it could take a while. So, and you need a lot of cardboard. A lot of people do this with pizza boxes. So if you want to collect a lot of pizza boxes from your neighborhood, or if you eat a lot of pizza yourself, if you eat an acre's worth of pizza, then you could do this. And it's a lower cost option because the materials, sometimes you could get for free or at low cost. So here's what the seed looks like, and many of you may have seen this already. It looks like something that comes out of a vacuum cleaner versus what we're used to looking at when we pick up our packets of garden seed or agricultural seed, where it's all uniform. Another reason we need that good site prep. We have some seeds that are heavy that will, stick to the soil. We have other seeds that are light and fluffy that can blow away. Oftentimes, these seeds are very, very small. Uh, so, you know, if you're using, if you have a small planting area, you're going to get a very small amount of seed. And we want that to distribute evenly. So we will combine it with a carrier, which can be clay-based kitty litter, clean play sand, rice hulls, something to bulk it up to ensure that, we don't start seeding and then, we get a couple square feet in and run out of seed. So this just helps it flow through seeders, or if you're broadcasting, it helps it spread evenly. And also, a lot of these seeds are dark. So combining it with a lighter material gives you that visual feedback of, oh, I seeded there. Um, and then we don't want to do all of that work and not do good management, right? And so having also that management plan in place ahead of time, you might need to adjust as you go, but just understanding, what it will take after you plant to A, help it establish properly, and B, keep it that way, maintain that diversity you intended when you planted it. Monitoring, I can't say this enough, go out and look. Go out and look. If you see something that looks off, ask somebody for help. Don't wait. Mowing and other maintenance practices in the long term, we use the rule of thirds, and you're going to have to continue to control invasive species. They're just in our landscape. They move around for animals, birds, cars, traffic, equipment. Cleaning equipment is very important. So if you are managing other parts of properties, or if you have a contractor helping you, make sure they clean their equipment and don't bring weed seed from other sites onto your property. Move them around. So after we do all that work, oops, I think I got my seeds out of order. Oh, here we go. I'm sorry. I somehow skipped this. I thought we were out of order a little bit. Going back one, what to expect. Again, site-specific recipe, multi-year process. What I tell people after you plant the meadow, the first year it sleeps, the second year it creeps, and the third year it leaps. I know that's kind of cheesy. That's what I learned when I moved to the Midwest and was studying in large-scale prairies and prairie remnants. It does take a while. It's not like your annual flowers or your zinnias or crops that pop up quickly. A lot of people think they did something wrong when they don't see something in the first year, or if it looks patchy. That's just the way it looks. We'll look at a case study at the end here. So being patient is key. And during that time, especially year 1 and 2, you're going to have to manage, annual weeds are going to come in and grow up stronger, faster, better than the wildflowers at first. And so counterintuitively, after you do all that work in the first year, if you see vegetation reaching 12 to 18 inches, 99.9% of the time, those are weeds. And we want to give those weeds a haircut and mow them back to 8 inches, usually 1 or 2 mowings in year 1, depending on the site. What that does is prevent the weeds from going to seed and dumping more seed onto the soil after you just exhausted that weed seed bank, and opening up that canopy for those low growing rosettes and seedlings that are underneath there, so they have less competition for resources and that could pop up. Even if you see things like black-eyed Susan, partridge pea, common species in a mix that come up quickly and flower, don't be afraid to mow. You might knock out a black-eyed Susan or two, but that seed is very inexpensive and can easily be put back in. We are managing for the greater good of that mix, the diversity of that mix. And so people say, oh, but I finally saw a flower. I know, it's hard, but that's what you have to do. I've had people in the first year don't see anything, think they failed, and maybe get a little bit embarrassed or like, oh, I must have done something wrong. Um, and they till it under, or they go out and buy more seed and put more seed on the site. That's not going to help. That seed is going to grow the same way, and you've often maybe wasted some time and money there. And then you might have to do some spot treatment, pooling, or string trimming of invasive species that come in. Now, I said this, but I'll repeat it. Site appropriate management plan. Sometimes these are game time decisions. If you see something, if you see a weed coming at first detection, try to get it right away so it doesn't, spread and create a larger infestation. And then in the long term, once that meadow has stabilized, you see most or all of the species in the mix growing. You see, less weeds. We switched to a rotational management, right? And so this is often done in the dormant season after the plants are done flowering. So we're not, chopping up the pollinators that are visiting or maybe monarch caterpillars that might be on milkweed. And so we do what we call the rule of thirds. In a smaller area, you could divide it in half, but bees and pollinators and caterpillars and other things are now overwintering in this habitat. And so we need to mow here so it doesn't grow up into woodies or weeds, but we don't want to take all of that shelter and habitat away. So you will divide it up into management units and do a rotation of mowing. So this third in one year, this third in the second year, this third in the third year, and then back. You might need to modify that if you see, oh, this edge is getting really weedy, or there's more woody encroachment, on the south end. So still takes some monitoring, but then we're finally getting, less work, less maintenance, as long as this is come in well, grown up, and is really kind of thriving. Um, there's other ways to do it other than mowing. Mowing's probably the easiest, but you can use grazing, controlled burning, things like that. Periodic thatch removal. So even in a small planting, you'll see that, the stems from previous years will accumulate on the soil surface. It's good to rake them or remove that thatch every once in a while to expose the soil. So when these plants are dropping seed, that seed hits the soil for them to regenerate. It's also good for birds that are kind of navigating for insects or seeds on the soil surface under the canopy. If it's very dense, they have a hard time walking around. So, we like to try to consider the needs of these animals we're targeting, but also we want to maintain this long term as meaningful habitat, right? So here's a little case study. This is on a big farm, but they are small plots. They're about 1.3 acres each for the plots. And then each of those plots was divided into 3. Here we were looking at different mixes and kind of tracking the process and what it takes. So some of that isn't very relevant for this talk. But they started off with mechanical shallow cultivation. Before that, the fields were in cover crops. That might not be a situation we were running into here, but they were harrowed, so shallow cultivation 3 times in the spring. This site did a spring seeding. They did use a no-till drill, which gives a little bit of advantage over broadcast seeding because those seeds get planted into the soil. Broadcast seeding is great too, as long as you roll over or tamp those seeds down. And you could do that with, one of those crank seeders, or if you have a small drop seeder, or even by hand, like chicken feed for a small site. The next year, they did that high mowing 3 times. Every time that vegetation reaches 12 to 18 inches, mow it back to 8. And then they did some targeted weed control. So here's what it looks like. This is the most important part. This is in upstate New York, so they have a little colder climate. Here, it might be a little longer timeline. But here's what it looks like as they're doing site prep with patchy weeds coming back. Seeding in May, June, nothing. July, crabgrass. July, crabgrass. So they mowed and mowed. There was other weeds mixed in here. August, mowed again. You could start seeing some things. The picture, it doesn't show it very well, but you could start seeing some things coming up in July and August. September here, you see a smattering of black-eyed Susan, some kind of hanging on through November, and then dormant. So first year, pretty boring. But under that crabgrass and under those weeds, if you can see this close-up picture at the bottom, you see all of these little broadleaf seedlings coming in. So they're under there. That's the reason for giving it those multiple haircuts in year one. It's going to look patchy and weedy. Looking for those indicator species that pop up early. Partridge pea, black-eyed Susan, and coreopsis are common ones. Will give you kind of an indication of what's happening. So that's a good thing if you see them. Monitoring weeds on first detection, be patient. Years 2 and 3 are coming, and so are more flowers. Here's year 2, again, April, May, doesn't look like much. June, we're starting to see some of those early spring flowering plants. Again, here you see a lot of yellow, a lot of coreopsis, and a lot of black-eyed Susan. Sometimes they're put in a mix heavy. They kind of act like a nurse crop. They will peter out, so don't say, oh, it's a monoculture. That's all I got. Planted a diverse prairie, and I just got black-eyed Susan. It's fine. They often look very yellow like this in the beginning. As time goes on, they will diversify. You'll still have some coreopsis and black-eyed Susan, but a lot of this the density will wane and other things will come in. And so it'll look something more like this in year 3, where you can see the bee balm and the monarda and coneflower and other things coming in. And then so on and so on. And that gets, more diverse as time goes on. And that is the end. I'm happy to take questions, comments, complaints. I'm not going to take, no, just kidding. But I'm happy to stay on and chat a little bit.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I don't think anybody has any complaints. I think that was amazing. Thank you so much for
Kelly.
sharing.
I don't think anybody has any
All
complaints.
of that.
That was amazing.
They might have their own complaints about their own,
Right. Okay. So I have been watching the chat and the Q&A. So I realized that we're at 1 o'clock. So I think my plan is just to ask a couple of these questions. Folks are welcome to hang on while we get through these few questions. I'm not going to ask all of them, but I will send these out to Kelly. And then Kelly, if you have time, you want to respond to them, you're welcome to.
Sure.
So let's see here. I'm going to take this easy question. Do you have any recommendation for where to buy buckwheat or the annual ryegrass seed if folks are interested in some other cropping?
Yeah, so a lot of the native seed companies, like places like Ernst, also sell cover crops. I could send out a list of places that do have these, and I also have a list of vendors that have organic seed as well. So Agway, your typical farm seed store will have them in bulk. You could get small packets, at the garden store, but if you're doing a large area, you will want to buy more than that.
Awesome. Sounds great. It seemed like there were a number of questions about solarization, but one of the big ones people were asking was basically, is it too late for them to start if they haven't started yet?
If they're seeding this fall?
Yes.
If you have high weed pressure or a lot of broadleaf perennial weeds, yes, it'll be too late. If it's just turf, you might be cutting it close, but the way the weather's been trending with warmer falls going later into the season, you might be okay. It's so weather dependent. It could be hot for the rest of July and half of August and then rain. So, it's a roll of the dice, that particular method. if we have good conditions, you might be able to eke it in. But if not, I don't know. I wish I had a crystal ball.
Don't we all? I feel like that would just make things so much easier in this line of
Yeah.
work. It looks like folks were also interested in maybe some alternative materials for solarization. Someone mentioned having very thick rubber mats on their property. I know you touched on cardboard. Um, is subbing in some of those materials okay, or should they really stick with the plastic?
Um, Thick rubber mats might work. It's a similar concept. I haven't, so all of these methods we have trialed in the field in different regions. And so I have a little more experience and comfortability recommending them as opposed to taking a guess. But I'm not saying it won't work, but I can't verify, if it's less or more effective because I haven't done that.
Perfect. Yeah. So maybe it's just a little trial and error on your
Yeah.
part
I
if
mean,
you're going to sub in.
if anybody has methods that have been working for them, we'd love to know more about it. I'm happy to talk about that, later offline.
Awesome. Thank you. Um, let's see. This was kind of a big question. They just mentioned that they underestimated the amount of work that this was going to take. And so is there kind of a lazy person version, or are there alternatives to turning lawn into something that's going to be beneficial if they don't have the time or the resources to make it
Mhm.
absolutely perfect?
Yeah, so sometimes we could tweak a seed mix to have some of those uh, plants that grow more readily, that are maybe a little more aggressive for a site like that, or having even a less diverse mix at first and then supplementing it so you're not, putting a lot of money into the mix if it's not ideal site prep. Um, but if you want the high diversity meadow, it's a labor of love. There are other options, a lot of times if seeding is a difficult process, um, we'll recommend using live plants that you could plug in and kind of expand over time. Um, and, we're talking about meadows here, but that's not the only thing that pollinators rely on. Planting trees and shrubs, that's a lot more intuitive for a lot of people, right? And so, like, flowering trees and shrubs are so floriferous, like a meadow in the sky. So planting a couple of those native trees and shrubs that support pollinators, and again, success is on a sliding scale of what you can do. And so, don't think you have to go all in to help. Little actions or smaller plantings can help, even if it's just a garden bed size. And we have tons of information on that online too.
Awesome. Sounds great. So I think I'm going to take two more questions here. The one that just came in about planting the seeds. Do you recommend covering them with straw, or do you leave them on the bare soil?
We have covered with straw in some instances, in particular if it's on a slope to hold the seed, or like a jute mat or those straw mats, so the seeds don't get washed down to the toe slope. But typically, we haven't. We do roll over it. So if you broadcast, roll over it. A smaller scale planting, sure, you could cover it with straw, um, but don't get hay or other things that might have a lot of weed and grass seed already in them. So you have to be careful with that.
Yes, definitely. Make sure you're getting straw, not hay. And one of the rules of thumbs that we use if we're applying straws, we want to see about 70% of bare soil underneath it. It's very a light dusting of straw. You're not piling it on like you would with grass seed. Okay, and then I'm going to ask this kind of two-part question, and this will be our last one. These are related to sod cutting. So, do they need to do anything about the depression that is left from the removal of several inches of sod? And if we already have the seed in refrigeration, is it appropriate to remove the sod and immediately apply it in the fall without an observation period for weed growth?
So the first question, no, you don't have to kind of backfill that. These plants will, because they're perennial and they have a lot of biomass, the meadow plants, they will begin to mulch that soil and rebuild that soil layer. Um, so no worries about that. You're not going super deep, just a couple inches. So you will have a depression there, but that will be, kind of remulch naturally. The question about, yes, you can do that theoretically, but it would be ideal, if possible, to do it a little earlier and just make sure that there's nothing in there that surprises you. And oftentimes with lawn, it's okay that places that have been in lawn for years and years and years. But Mother Nature likes to throw us that those variables, so always expect the unexpected.
All
And I'm
right.
happy
So
to go through these offline. And here, I'll also put my email in the chat so people can contact me. I'm happy to help out as I can. It's good if you have questions to give some lead time, especially this time of year when I'm out in the field a lot.
thank you so much, Kelly. Yeah, really appreciate you offering up your email so folks can get you some more
Yeah, don't
specific
be
questions.
intimidated,
Yeah,
it's fun. Once you know what you're getting into, it's good to see that process and the fruits of your labor.
absolutely. All right. So, like I said, I will collect all of these questions both in the chat and in the Q&A box, get those out to Kelly. We'll work on responding to some of those. We'll also collect some of the resources that we've shared already in the chat, get the recording. So it'll be a little bit until we can get everything out to everybody. But do look for that email with all of those additional resources in addition to this recorded webinar. So thank you again, everybody, for joining today. Thank you so much, Kelly, for being
Of course.
here and sharing all of your knowledge. I am always so impressed every time I hear a presentation from you, and I feel like I just heard from you actually, and I feel like I gained so much more even from today's webinar. So thank you again for
Yeah,
being
it's
here.
it's good to have somebody make the mistakes first and then tell everybody about them.
It is nice. Yes, we
Yeah.
appreciate the lessons learned.
Oh,
All
thanks
right.
for
Well,
having me.
thank you, everybody. Have a great day.